Hello and welcome to everybody who has just joined us for this webinar. This is the second webinar in the mini e-course series on how to review Ipcc assessment reports, webinars and guidance for climate experts, which is hosted by the Future Climate for Africa program. Today's webinar is entitled How to Conduct an Ipcc Review. My name is Karen Morris, and I'm a communications officer at South North in Cape Town, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. Our presenters today are Dr. Leo Meyer and Professor Arthur Peterson. Our presenters today will conduct a series of presentations of about 25 minutes each, and I will be keeping them to time very strictly. We will only be exchanging questions and answers after all the presentations have been made. Attendees are asked to submit their questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of their screens. Please note the particular panelist to whom you'd like to address the question. And as the moderator, I will screen the questions and relay them verbally to the panelists. Our colleague, Maria Jose Pacha of the CDKN program, will be translating any questions that we have in Spanish into English for presenters to respond to. We'll aim to answer as many questions as we can in the allotted time, and any questions that we can't answer live, we will address in writing following the event. The Q&A will be followed by a 2-minute poll in which we encourage everyone to participate. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the FCFA website. PDF copies of the English, Spanish, and French presentations will be available on the website following the webinar. Registrants will be notified as soon as these are made available online. Please consider sharing these with anyone you may know and would like to view it but couldn't attend today. I now hand over to Dr. Leo Meyer, who will continue with the next part of the presentations.
Hello, everybody, and hopefully you see the first slide of my part of the presentation in front of you on how to conduct a review. Let me very briefly introduce myself. I have been involved in the Ipcc since 1995, and I have been project leader and author for several reports. Last one was the synthesis report of 2014. Now I'm independent, but I'm still contributing, as I believe that the Ipcc reports are crucial to keeping the world informed about the threats of climate changes and the way to deal with them. You may recall the previous webinar, how the Ipcc works. You can consult it on the web page and the recording. And now we will go in more depth on actually how to do the review. And let me start with what we call the learning objectives for this part. Learning objectives for this course. If you have followed the full course, including the previous one, you can describe how the Ipcc works. You will be able to phrase effective review comments based on your own experience. And it would even be best if you could introduce some additional knowledge from local and regional scientific literature assessment reports. We have to make one disclaimer, actually. Everything we tell you here is our own responsibility from Future Climate for Africa and the presenters. It is not a formal project by the Ipcc, but they have reviewed it and they supported it fully. Let us describe in brief the writing and the review process. This was handled in the first course last week as well, but let me recap it. Of course, first of all, about reports, the panel, so the government representatives of Ipcc, they decide about the outline, and then an author team has to be selected by all the officials in the Ipcc. Authors will start what they call a zero order draft, which is just an internal piece of work. But once that has sort of matured, they will have a first order draft ready that should be reviewed for 8 weeks by experts, like you, for instance. And now, currently, there is the review of the first order draft of the Group 2 report of the 6th assessment, which is on climate change, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And we hope to get you engaged in that one. When they have dealt with all the reviews, they write a second order draft and also a first summary, a summary for policymakers called SPM. That is also reviewed simultaneously by both governments and expert reviewers. Then the authors will have to write a final draft and another reviewed summary that is reviewed for governments by governments only. And then everything is lined up for a official approval session by all the governments, a panel session where they will approve the summary for policymakers under scrutiny of the authors, line by line, and also accept the underlying report. Then it's not finished yet. Then the report still has to be published officially when all the grammar errors and typos and editing and layout things are completed. Now, let me also a bit of a recap. What are who are the actors in the review process? The first ones, the expert reviewers, what it's all about. They volunteer to review parts of Ipcc reports. Expert reviewers can be nominated by governments, by non-governmental organizations, academia, etc. But they can also simply register themselves without any nomination. And that is where we would like to focus on as well. It's important to know that for a first order draft, the governments are not yet involved. They only come aboard when the report is a little bit more mature and when it has a summary for policymakers in draft form. The authors, lead authors and coordinating lead authors, they have to consider each and individual review comment one by one, and they have to justify the manner in which they respond to them. And their response files actually will become public after publication. For the report of Working Group 2 that we are looking into later, that will be actually in a little bit more than 2 years publication. Important to know that the review process is overseen by what we call review editors. These are senior scientists with Ipcc experience, ensuring that all substantive comments, so notice spelling errors, etc., are dealt with appropriately, and they have to report about that to the panel as well, that they agree with the way it's handled, and without their signature, there is no report. So their role is quite important. Now, of course, the question that you may ask is how actually do you become an Ipcc expert reviewer? And on the outstanding review of the report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, which is running actually now until the 13th of December. Well, the first step is quite simple. You have to register at the link, which is also available at the website. Once you've done that, you have to take a couple of hurdles. You have to self-declare your expertise. And if you have publications, you can mention them. If you have no publications at all, that is not a problem. You only have to declare that you're an expert on a certain area in climate change, but normally you will be accepted. And they will send you credentials, and that will give you access to the draft chapters. And I will give you an example of that and other documentation that you need for doing the review. And then you have time to upload your expert review comments until the 13th of December, midnight. Now let me do a little sidestep, see if that works. Yeah, this is when you have registered and you have access to the chapters, then this is the screen that you will see from the Ipcc. I'm not going to read it out. You see here all the chapters. Unfortunately, without the titles, but maybe they will restore that later. But what is important here is this sentence: all draft chapters and figures are confidential and provided solely for the purpose of this review. Drafts may not be cited, quoted, or distributed. And you have to sort of agree with that before you can continue. I have made a list of the chapters, including their names, because it is a little bit easier to find when I have downloaded them. I'm a expert reviewer as well. So you can see a long list of chapters, but it does include from chapter 9 to chapter 15 regional chapters, which I think may be of particular interest to you. Let me give you one example for the chapter on Africa, for instance. You can see at the top of it all the authors. Maybe within your network you may see some familiar names. If I scroll down to part of the table of contents, you can see an executive summary. That will be actually the first thing to read to get a general idea, and then you can pick and choose whatever part is of interest to you. I would also like to particularly note at the bottom of the table of contents are the FAQs, the frequently asked questions. For instance, is there hope that African countries would be able to secure food for their growing population under changing climate conditions? These are general questions, but they're very policy relevant, and then the authors write whatever they know from literature to answer those questions. Let me give another example, which is on Central and South America. It's basically follows more or less the same format, but also here an executive summary and a couple of chapters in all sections, and a series of frequently asked questions. Well, I hope this sort of will raise your curiosity. Actually, when you want to note down your review comments, there are specific Excel sheets that you can download. You have to indicate the chapter and exactly where you can find the lines that are relevant, and then you can write your comments. It also contains a page with detailed instructions actually how to do it. You have ample time to sort that out. Let me go back to the main presentation. The Ipcc itself has provided also guidance for reviewers. It's a bit formal. I want to go through it quickly, and we will add some more detail to that later. The purpose of an expert review is that we have a comprehensive, objective, and balanced report of high quality. And the experts are requested to give information on their relevant scientific and technical expertise. It's not a public review, and experts are to sign this confidentiality agreement that I showed to you. Important for you to know that if you're reviewing, don't pay attention to spelling mistakes or layout things or small editorial things. The technical support units, the secretariats of the working groups will take care of that. Just focus on substantive issues. And you have to provide your comments in English using this Excel sheet that I showed to you. What can you do? It could be not just on a line, but also on the general structure. If you miss certain subjects that are not properly dealt with, it is about, do they have all the literature aboard that is necessary? And you can provide specific text suggestions that you think would be better and provide supporting evidence from literature. When you do that, give full citations of the papers. Another way is that normally, of course, chapters expand because authors want to write everything they know, but not everything would be really interesting for society and the policymakers. So if you see things that could be shortened pieces of text, please let the authors know. It's not just text, it's also graphics and tables that need to be transparent and understandable. And of course, you cannot add much new text because authors are required to work within base length constrictions. That constraints that has to do with basically with time and money. When you are a first-time reviewer, you may wonder, all these chapters and more than 1,000 pages, where to start? Well, we have written a small guidance for first-time reviewers. You can find them on the web. And let me highlight some points out of that. How could you approach this Working Group 2 report? Well, first, study the chapter titles of the report. I showed you the list that's particularly interested. It could be a regional chapter or a certain sector, agriculture or water. Start reading with the executive summary and the table of contents, and then pick and choose issues that are of interest to you. Then you sort of dive into the chapters. What helps me actually is using the search function in the PDFs for finding certain catchwords that are particularly important. For instance, for the Netherlands, extreme events and sea level rise, and maybe something different for other countries. Very important is be critical, because authors may not know everything. Your knowledge counts as well. And don't be afraid to say, well, I don't understand this, this is jargon, this is not consistent with other informations, the graphs are not clear, and we suggest to do this and that. Are the messages clear? Because this report is not specifically written for other scientists, but it is specifically written for policymakers and the society at large. So are the messages, at least the key messages, are they clear and understand? And are they relevant without being prescriptive? As has been explained in the previous webinar. Ipcc can inform policymakers, but Ipcc does not prescribe what policymakers or companies or societies have to do. Is important information missing, or parts that are overlapping or even repetitive? That happens. Also mentioned the substantive comments. It's a little bit repetitive here. And I think we are well ahead of time here, and I would like to hand over to my colleague, Professor Arthur Peterson, and stop share screen and then ask her, Arthur, it will be up to you to continue.
Thank you, Leo. Let me start my video. So my name is Arthur Peterson. I'm a former colleague of Dr. Leo Meijers, where we both worked at the PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and have also been, like Leo has been, a delegate of the Dutch government to the Ipcc, where you have the role to make sure that the Ipcc reports from the government's point of view are both understandable as well as usable. And one of the things I've been very much involved with is also the quality of the reports and the language that has been used to talk about uncertainty. So what I will do now is talk about the language in the Ipcc reports, focusing first on the point picking up from what Leo Meijers just said about language that may actually be prescriptive if you're not careful in how you write it down. And we'll give some examples of that. So this is one thing to look at. And then I will focus more on the uncertainties and how they are communicated in Ipcc reports. So this whole phrase that the Ipcc cannot be policy relevant, it must be policy relevant, but should not be policy prescriptive. There are some examples of how you can do it correctly and when it's a problem. And typically, if you read the report and you see words like must or should or have to, you really have to look at whether they are formulated in a way that does not prescribe an action. So to give an example, the top one is okay. So to limit the warming with a particular probability, the carbon budget must not exceed a particular size. That's okay because it is formulated in a conditional sense. If you want to limit the warming to a particular extent with a particular probability, there's a limit that you must take into account. But the next example, which is not formulated with a conditionality, is problematic from that perspective, because if you would say the carbon budget must not exceed a particular amount of gigatons carbon, that is taken as policy prescriptive. Now, of course, scientists all have views, and actually governments together may decide that we must not exceed that. But the important thing of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that it is a scientific body. It has to assess, to summarize and assess everything we've learned in the scientific research, which means we must be very careful in that scientific body not to make policy prescriptive statements. So that's something to take into account. Now, you will often see in the Ipcc specific words that are in italics, and that's words like likely. And we'll get to those words, what they mean and how they are used. But it's important, if you're able to review the use of that word as well, or those words, those uncertainty words, in terms of whether they are clear, and if you're even able to go in depth and look into a chapter and see what is this statement based on. So in order to be able to do that, I will explain a little bit more about the language. But first, uncertainty as such. There's a lot of uncertainty in all these Ipcc reports. So in the middle, in a sense, there's a whole chain here of uncertainty from what happens with the future of the global population and the amount of energy that's used and the way energy is produced, and then the greenhouse gases that get emitted into the atmosphere. That's all, in a sense, related to working group 3. If you also think about how we can mitigate these emissions, how we can move towards renewables, for instance. And here in the middle of the graph, we have the question of what's the consequence of all these emissions of greenhouse gases in terms of the concentrations of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, and then the effects both in the global average sense on the temperature, but we're also really interested in what's happening regionally, and ultimately in what are the impacts of these changes for specific ecosystems or natural systems. And that's working group 2 territory, where we look at the impacts. Adaptation is looking at what are ways we can prepare our societies to adapt to these changes in order for many of these impacts to prevent them from occurring. What I show here is one way to talk about uncertainty in the Ipcc is to use a vocabulary that uses the word confidence. So you can have very high confidence in a particular statement, or you can have very low confidence in a particular statement. And it's helpful for readers to understand what are people more certain of and what are the scientists less certain of. To understand what a statement that has high or very high confidence, what that means, the Ipcc is looking at this from 2 different lenses. So one is on evidence, and that's then related to how much evidence is there available to underpin a particular statement. So that's from measurements or from models or other types of studies. Is it limited to the highest kind of level of the amount of evidence? Is it robust? The other axis is about agreement between different scientists. So here you have to think about a peer group of scientists. Is there a low agreement in that group, or is there a high agreement? There are some extreme cases. It can be that there is very limited evidence. We don't have much evidence yet, but there is actually a very high agreement among the experts that something is happening or is the case. Only if this is really dark, if you are in the, let's say, upper right-hand corner, is where we would expect statements to have, in a summary statement, a high confidence or a very high confidence. And I want to give an example of that, which is from the latest special report on oceans and cryosphere, which came out recently. And here's it's 2 sentences, and each of them has a confidence statement in it. So the first sentence reads, global mean sea level is rising. Well, we're completely certain about that, so there's not even a confidence statement there. With an acceleration in recent decades, so we see global mean sea level going up in an accelerated sense. And why is that? And that's where this first confidence statement comes in. It's due to the increasing rates of ice loss from Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets. And then there is, in parentheses, very high confidence. So that's just to indicate that there is a large agreement among the experts, and there's robust evidence that these ice loss from Greenland and Antarctic are increasingly being lost. Then the second example, and there's another element in that first sentence, as well as continued glacier mass loss and ocean thermal expansion. You don't put these confidence statements everywhere. You don't have to. The second has a somewhat lower level of confidence, but still high. So that's as a consequence, for instance, of this sea level rise, increases, if you combine it with increases in tropical cyclone winds and rainfall, and there's increases in extreme waves, when you combine that with that sea level rise, or to say relative sea level rise, because also land may be subsiding, then you get an increase. It exacerbates the extreme sea level events and coastal hazards that have been identified in the report. And there's a high confidence attached to that statement. So those are two examples of the use of the word confidence that you also may encounter, and you may reflect on it. Is it clear in a particular context, or do I understand why they can say it is very high? For instance, they may discuss that there is completely no agreement in the scientific literature. Then it's very difficult to get a very high confidence statement. Another way to talk about uncertainty in the Ipcc is by using likelihoods, and that's a way to express let's say, how certain really are we about a statement in terms of a probability. So the highest level of likelihood that's used in the Ipcc, and that's, well, there are statements for which it has been used, is that something is virtually certain. And in the Ipcc context, that means more than 99% certain. More often used are the terms very likely and likely, with very likely meaning more than 90% certainty that, according to the experts in the Ipcc, a particular statement is true. They say it's very likely. Or they say, and that's the next category, something is likely, it means a 2/3 chance, 66% chance that a particular statement is true. In the meantime, so this was used in many of the Ipcc reports. In the meantime, there's also a 95% probability statement, which I show in the next one. Which is the present estimate in the latest Ipcc report of the likelihood that humans have been causing most of the warming that we see. So the largest part of the warming over the past half century is extremely likely due to anthropogenic causes. And this assessment of 95% chance includes all the uncertainties that the scientists are reflecting on, both in measurements but also in climate models. And it's important to realize that models are very often used and have to be used in climate change studies. And there are some graphs in the bottom that show different model results that illustrate this statement that it is now extremely likely, 95% certain, that humans are causing most of the warming. Let's focus on the middle graph, where you see a black line with the temperature going up in the beginning of the 20th century and the temperature going up at the end of the 20th century. If you now use a model or set of models where you simulate the temperature based on different assumptions, you can assume in one of the models that there are no human influences on the climate, and then you get the blue band where you see there's a little bit increase. You can explain part of the increase in the beginning of the 20th century, and that's effects from changes in solar radiation and changes in volcanoes, all natural causes. But at the end of the 20th century, it is not possible to simulate the significant increase that we see in the temperatures. And the only way to explain that then is through the greenhouse gases that are included in the model. So that's good for you to realize that uncertainties can also be expressed in a probabilistic sense. And there will be many statements that you could critically review in terms of why do you say this is extremely likely, because you would like to be able to understand why the authors come up with that. Then let's move to the issue of the clarity of messages. So one is the clarity of talking about the uncertainties. The other is the clarity of how we illustrate the messages graphically, how graphics is used by the Ipcc. And one way to assess how well they do it is through what we call the MADE principle. So you have to focus on the message, whether that's really clear, whether a particular graph is clear. I will show two examples, one of a graph that's not very clear and one of a graph that I think is very clear. Audience, focus on who is this graph for? Is this an appropriate visual for that particular audience? Then there is the principle of design. Have good design principles being used in creating this graph. Graphic designers have rules for what's clear, what's not clear, and have they been applied. And finally, what's very important is to actually test these graphs on the intended audience to find out whether whether these principles have been adhered to. So here is an example of a graph in the previous IPCC round. This was in the third working group contribution to the fifth assessment report. And what we see here is a graph that already needs so much text to explain what's in the graph. And there are so many elements in this graph, or this set of graphs, that it is accurate, and it does contain the information that the authors want to convey, but it is actually a bit too much, I think, for many people to understand what's happening. So what is shown here, just to start talking about it, and then you may start to understand the graph, but the problem is often you just see the graph and you don't have someone talking to it. What's shown here is all sorts of future pathways of what's happening with future greenhouse gas emissions, and they show separately on the left-hand side emissions until 2030, and they're grouped in two different sets of these emissions. So a set where that's all below 50, and this is set with all above 55 in a particular year, just to separate these two types of paths. And then they say, if in the future we want to go down to below 2 degrees, how much reduction of CO2 emissions do we need per year, depending on where we were in 2030? So do we have, and this is in the past have only gone up, right? So in the future, the emissions have to go down by 3% per year, or 6% per year, or 9% per year, which shows that if you don't go down soon enough, you have to go down so quickly that it has never actually been realized before. So that's one of the reasons for inclusion of this graph. And here it also shows you separately how quickly does the share of zero and low carbon energy have to go up in order to be able to meet, for instance, the 2-degree target. And you see that especially if you don't start reducing relatively soon, you will need a 240% increase by 2050 compared to 2030. So it's a huge exercise that's still needed. So this is already a whole narrative to start explaining to you what's in this graph, which, as I say, is very informative and has a lot of information in it, but it's hard in terms of a communicative device to really understand. This graph is, I think, much easier to get, and it has partly the same message, that there is a total carbon budget which we shouldn't go over if you want to stay below 2 degrees with a particular probability of 2,900 gigatons. This is the amount that we have already used, but it was already used until 2011, so we're a bit further now, of course. And this is the amount then that's remaining, while knowing that we are emitting about 40 gigatons a year. So this is not going to last very long if we don't do anything against that. So that's, I think, a very useful graph, a very simple graph to bring home the same message as in the sense in the previous graph. So this is to make clear that we really have to start reducing, and this is another way to make clear that we really have to start reducing these emissions if we want to stay below 2 degrees. So next, two topics I would like to talk about is first about the use of different literature sources, and then I would like to say a little bit about how comments can be more or less effective, and then I'll hand over back to Leo Meyer. So the different literature sources that can be used, of course, the literature sources in the IPCC are often peer-reviewed articles, but you must be aware that it's not only peer-reviewed articles that are used in the IPCC, or that should be used, because often a lot of information is available in what's called grey literature. So those may be reports from governments, industry, or other organizations, and I'll get to say something about the role of those in a minute. So first of all, it's important for influential statements in the IPCC report to check how they are underpinned. So then you go to the chapter and you read and you look at What is the literature that's used? What are the articles that are used to underpin this statement? If you don't have access through your university, or if you're not affiliated to a university to a particular journal article, it's always possible to send a request to the United Nations Environment Programme to get access to particular literature in the relevant chapter. There is a provision in order to create full transparency to evaluate the Ipcc report, even if you don't have the access to the journals yourself. But it may well be that you have access to information that's not yet used in the report, and that's not necessarily a peer-reviewed article. And then it's possible to suggest that source of that reference to be used. And also, of course, it's important then to indicate, well, what is in that reference, so that they can take into account and maybe adjust statements or add more details. You can do that, and you can even do that if the language is not English. There needs to be a short summary in English, and there will be a judgment of including new references by the relevant chapter team. But typically, authors are really grateful if relevant information on an important statement or set of statements is offered to them by highlighting what this gray literature and giving a summary of it. What you cannot use, and that's important to realize as well, but it's because of quality assurance and the type of publication, is blogs, social networks, personal communications. So this is all for both transparency and quality reasons. That's not expected. So the last slide I will talk to, and then I'll hand it back to Dr. Leo Meijer. It's very important that if you formulate comments, that you do that in a very accessible way, which means you have to be not long-winded, you have to be very short, you have to be very precise, and you have to concretely say what you want to see changed and why. It's not just about adding text, because there is limitations in the amount of pages that they have in a chapter, so you should also provide some priorities in terms of what can be deleted if you want additions of text. That's typically considered really helpful. You have to give, and if you have shortenings or combinations, suggest how you want your authors to do that, so that they can then check the proposal, and if they agree with it, they can just implement it. And finally, you may refer to particular articles that are not yet used, or you have new information. Give as full as possible then the reference, so that people know where to find it, or give them more information about grey literature if that's not readily available, but it may be available through the web. So that's for my part, and then I'll hand over back to Dr. Leo Meijer.
So, again, hello everybody, and thank you, Arthur, for transferring to me. Once you have gone through all of this and you have submitted review comments, then the next question, of course, is, so what do authors do after you have delivered your comments? Well, first of all, as said, each comment must be considered. And remember, that's a hell of a job, because one report, one draft report may get over 20,000 comments, and each and every comment has to be looked into. They can do different things with the comment. They can accept it and adjust the text. If they think it's not a valid comment, they can reject it. What often happens, it's combined with other comments, and then parts of text are rewritten. Sometimes authors have no clue what to do with the comment, and they say something like a thank you or noted or rewritten. There are many variations. Authors will focus on substantive comments and not on spelling mistakes or editorial things, but sometimes the difference is quite difficult to see. Even moving a comma from one part of the sentence to another part of the sentence may completely change the meaning. So it's not always easy to discern between those two. As said, actually, all the author responses will, at the very end of the publication, become publicly available, and then you can check what they actually have done with them. Then let me give you briefly a few examples of comments in the stylized forms, which has been which may clarify a little bit more how authors look at comments. For instance, somebody, the report itself is not important, but someone found a sentence and said, the very likely here seems to contradict use of the verbal may in the text line. Suggests to reconsider which uncertainty modifier to use. Arthur actually has explained how these uncertainty qualifiers are there. And here's a reviewer that has signaled a contradiction internally in a sentence, and text has been modified to do that. So contradictions in the text. Then somebody discovered a sentence, what does spatial variation in SS1 mean and why is it related to ANSO Modoki? Unclear. As explained before, this is a report for policymakers, and you can expect some proficiency in science, but this is of course jargon that nobody understands, and the authors rightly said that they've reworded the sentence to make it clearer. Then the third one, somebody noted that ocean acidification in the Caribbean corals were not addressed in the report, and while there's a lot of research in this area, this is a nice example of finding a shortcoming in an assessment and adding a specific literature addressing that, which the authors have done. So contradictions, jargon, new literature are all quite valid additions. Let me now come to what we want to do next. We have poured a lot of information over you in these first two webinars, but there is a next phase for those who are interested. Once you're working on your review comments after registration, and you may think, how do I phrase it properly? How do I take all these lessons into account? Can I get some help with that? And then we offer you the option to help you personally. The three presenters, Jean-Pascal van Ipcc from the previous one, Arthur and me. And we can help you with the phrasing of the comments and answer the questions that you may have. Important to know, we cannot do the review for you. It's your expertise that counts. We can only help to make your comments more effective. And important to know, if you join into this, all correspondence with us will be kept completely confidential, not shared with others. After this presentation, Future Climate for Africa, I will send you an email with a link to the registration for this one-to-one feedback part. And you can register for that until the 8th of November. There is one point that the number of participants, we have to limit it because of the amount of time that three presenters have. So we may have to set priority. First-time reviewers from developing countries are, I think, the most important, and may specifically call upon women climate scientists. We think that a gender balance in review is equally important. But we will do this all on a first come, first serve basis. That brings me almost to the end. We have to acknowledge a couple of sponsors that made all this work possible. It's British funding actually in the main part. And where do I have it? The NERC is the Natural Environment Research Council, and UK8, it's a part of the Development Cooperation Ministry in England. And Dutch Ministry has given some support, and IDRC in Canada. We are of course grateful for them for their support. Just bear with us a couple of more minutes for the last parts. Shortly, we will start the question and answer session moderated by Karen. If questions pop up in you after all this presentation, please feel free to send an email to us and use this email address. We will take them up in the weeks to come. The website that we have made for you contains a lot of information, not only recordings and the presentations, but also a couple of useful links with other guidance material, including this note for first-time reviewers. So hopefully we have encouraged you to register as an expert reviewer of this working group 2 report. Link is also available on the website. Having said that, I would like to hand over to Karen for the Q&A session. Karen, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Leo. All right, so we're going to move over to the Q&As. We encourage all participants to please submit your questions via the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. There are a couple of questions there now, so I'm going to relay them verbally to the presenters. And as you said, those questions that we cannot cover during this time, we will address them verbally, address them after the webinar online. So the first question is for Leo, and it says, what is the minimum number of chapters in a report an expert reviewer can review?
Okay, a good question. You don't need to review a full chapter. You don't even need to review a full section. Each comment, even if it's on just one single paragraph or one single graph or one table, is valid. So even submitting just one comment is useful. There is the minimum number is actually minimum number of comments is 1, and you don't need to go through a complete chapter because you're allowed to send in as many comments as you want, depending on the amount of time and expertise that you have. So minimum number of chapters is 1, and the minimum number in that chapter would be, well, 1 comment. But of course, it would be more useful if you take a close look at some more text. But that is completely up to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leo. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. And it says, can you use literature published by think tanks?
That's a one for Arthur, I would say.
So the answer is yes, you can, because there are think tanks that put out high quality literature, high quality reports. The whole thing is about the author team that has to judge whether the quality of a particular report is good enough to be warranted and included in the references. But there are many think tanks that meet the kind of minimal standards. So the short answer is yes. The longer answer, in a sense, is sometimes for a particular claim, if there is also peer-reviewed literature, it's better to make reference to peer-reviewed literature than to make reference to only, let's say, a think tank report. But sometimes the information is not available in the peer-reviewed literature, so it's perfectly fine to do that.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the next question is, how is judgment made to include additional literature, in brackets, either grey or peer-reviewed articles suggested by reviewers in a report?
So let me see if I get it. So the judgment is made always by the authors on whether they make changes if they receive a comment. So if you make a suggestion to include another piece of literature, they will have to make the judgment of whether they include it or not, and they will also be transparent about that. So it takes a while, but if you submit your comment now and then the report is out, and then sometime after that, you can actually look at what they said in response to your specific comment. So you can actually trace why they did not, in case they didn't include a particular additional reference.
May I add to that? If, for instance, someone has a newspaper article or a blog or something from the internet, then often that will not be accepted by authors because it has to have a certain amount of quality and some form of review. So newspapers, magazines, internet blogs, etc., are normally not used as a source for the literature source.
Okay, all right. Thank you for those. So there is just a follow-up to the first question. And it says, what is the max number of chapters one is allowed to review?
You can review all chapters if you have all the time in the world, but there is no maximum to amount of comments. Of course, you have to have a little bit of pity with the authors who have to deal with 20 to 40,000 comments, but there is formally no maximum, and the Excel sheet that gives you ample room for phrase as many comments as you want. You can also do this with a group actually, and then you need one central person to upload it. No maximum number is there.
Yes, thank you for that. The next one is there a deadline, number of days or weeks given for reviewing a paper?
Absolutely. For each review of each report, there's a very strict start and a very strict deadline. The review of the Working Group 2 report, which is running now, and which you are invited to join as an expert reviewer, that has started the 18th of October, so last week, and it will end by the 13th of December, midnight, Central European time. Please note that after that, so the 14th of December, you're just late. You cannot submit any comments anymore. So there is time, but since the authors have to go through all the review comments and prepare a next version, and they have a very strict timeline where approval sessions are already planned years ahead, there is no way on being lenient with deadlines. Deadline is the real deadline in Ipcc.
Okay, there's another one. How do reviewers know the outcome of the review conducted? Is there a way to follow up on this?
That's an excellent question. Maybe Arthur, you would like to add to that as well. The best way is actually after publication of the report, because the expert review comments and responses to authors will be published. But that, for instance, for this report that we're looking now, that we showed, that's over 2 years. So that is, and you may be curious to know much earlier what they did with it. Now, the only way to deal with that is also review, in this case, the second order draft of the Working Group 2 report, and register again as an expert reviewer, and then go to the text and see if it's been changed and if your comments have been somehow taken into account. If not, sometimes there may be the possibility to contact authors, but of course they don't want to be spammed by hundreds of emails. But theoretically, if you think, well, this is really something that should have been taken into account, you may try to contact the authors through the technical support units of Working Group 2. You can find them, their addresses on the internet. But unfortunately, it's not possible to know directly exactly what happened with the comments, and because those answers are only provided at the very, very end of the pipeline of production of a report.
Okay, thank you. Arthur, do you have any comments to add to that?
No.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, then I see this one in Spanish from Paula. Maria Zay, would you like to have a look at that one and translate it for us, please? All right.
Okay, so Paola Villavicencio is asking whether the reviewers need to be climatologists or can also be scientists related with the social sciences. So that first question. Then whether reviewers need to participate necessarily in the 2 revisions, the first and the second draft, or a reviewer can choose if it's only one of the draft is reviewed.
Shall I answer both questions, Leo?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the second question is very, very simple in terms of each review is treated separately. So you can participate in this review, or there will be a next round of review as well. You can do both. So it's up to when you do have time, and you know there is a window to review. So that's to answer that question. And I think the first question is very important. And increasingly social scientists have been involved in the Ipcc, and many of the Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 chapters have been written also by social scientists. So typically in Working Group 1, which is on the physical basis of climate change, of course there are many physical climate scientists engaged in both writing and reviewing that report. But even there, if you are not a physical scientist and as a social scientist, you can ask questions. And you can post comments in terms of if things are not clear. So it's about and because these things are also for policymakers that are often themselves not climate scientists, right? So that already points out that with many different disciplinary backgrounds, you can give good comments. Now, The working group 2 report that we are that we can review is very heavily combination of ecological statements on the impacts, but also social science statements on the impacts, and adaptation is very largely also a social scientific question. So even in terms of the specialty, particular articles that you may be aware of, particular approaches that are not properly handled yet, in the Ipcc report you can give a contribution as a social scientist.
Yes, may I add to that, if you have participated in the expert review of the first auto draft and you have submitted comments, then you will automatically be invited when the second auto draft is due, and then you will be invited again to comment. But it is of course not compulsory. It will be totally up to you whether or not to do that. And one more, all disciplines are very welcome in Ipcc. Social science, physical science, but also legal people. And actually, it is really important to have use of all different disciplines from that you have in universities, and have all those different views integrated in an Ipcc report. Next question.
Okay, thank you. The next one, and there's another one that's tied to this first one. So do review comments need to be supported by literature reference? And then the next question after that is, can I cite my own piece of published work as source to justify comments I make on the report?
Shall I take that one? If you have literature references that support your comment, then that is very, very welcome. It is not always necessary. For instance, if a sentence is contradicting itself or very unclear, then you don't need to add any literature reference. But if you feel that a certain subject is missing and you have an important conclusion from literature, yes, then you should give the literature reference, preferably including its URL, because that's so for internet that will save authors time to find it.
Yeah, and it's no problem if it's your own work. So you can, without any problem, make a reference to some piece of your own work that adds something to or gives a different conclusion to what's in the draft. Of course, the authors will see that the ones who are proposing to have their work cited are the same, right? So they will really look for how much does it really add. But it's perfectly valid to bring it up.
Okay, thank you. Is it still time to join the ongoing review? If so, how quickly to proceed?
Yes, there is time. The review will actually, you will have time at the very latest to the 6th of December, but I would certainly recommend to do this in the next couple of days or a week or so. Because you will need time to find out the pieces of text that are of interest to you and to phrase your comments. And even if you want to join the feedback part from our side, then it will even take some more time for going back and forth with us. Hopefully that answers the question. Arthur, anything to add? Arthur?
No.
Good.
Okay. Let me go through the next one. Are there professionals whose role it is to review the document as a whole following the first order and second order draft? That is, before taking the document to plenary. So
let me start answering that question. So in terms of professionals, some governments, so I believe that governments have a huge responsibility to use the resources that they have. For instance, if they have national government labs or they have scientists on the government payroll, to put some of them to the task of as a professional, in a sense, to do this peer review of the Ipcc report as part of their jobs. So there are some governments that gives this a task in a very professional way, dividing up the work. But there are not many that really do that. So maybe Leo, you can expand on this one.
I'm not quite sure what the question was. Could you help me?
Yeah, so that's the question from 226. Are there professionals whose role it is to review the document as a whole, following the first order and second order draft?
Well, in practice, I think hardly, because it's just too much work. What happens with the second order draft review, when there is a summary for policymakers, then it's easier because that is only 20 pages or so, 25 pages. And then people with a general overview can review the whole, at least a summary of the whole report. But going through all the chapters, which is not for just one individual or one party or just one country, I think just too much.
All right, then we've got another question. It says, is there a chance to discuss the comment with TSU, LA or CLA in case it's rejected, in order to know what the reason is for the rejection?
Normally not. You will only see if a comment is really rejected at the very, very end of the process. And what authors have to do, actually, if they reject a comment, they have to add the reason why. They cannot just say rejected, they have to explain why, because it contradicts literature or whatever reason they have. And correspondence on that may be in some cases possible, but it's actually not quite often used. And there is, as far as I know, not an open platform or so where you can continue questions and answers on rejected comments.
Thank you, Leo. How can I maximize my input in reviewing with limited references, especially in Africa?
Shall I take that one?
Yeah.
As an individual, just try to find that part where you feel that you really have additional expertise. If you have that and you see in the text that authors have missed something, then you can make a very important and valuable contribution. But your guide will be your own expertise and your own interest in the subject, what you can bring to the Ipcc. So I think that should be the answer. Have you a better answer, Arthur?
No, I mean, it's maximizing your input is indeed where do you also really want to spend your time and energy on, in terms of which conclusions are most important for your region. And then you can focus on, are there clear messages there? So you can focus on the clarity, or are there things really lacking that should be, in terms also of information and data, that should be flagged in the text itself, because sometimes there is no information and there are many white spots on maps, but it's good to have text for that as well.
Okay, thank you. So there is another question. What are the main next steps for doing the review?
Okay, as we said in the presentation, 1, register as an expert reviewer through the link that has been provided to you in this presentation, but you can also find it on the web and also on the website of the Ipcc itself by Googling. Once you have registered, you will get access details to download the chapters, and then perhaps read the guidance for first-time reviewers first, which you can find under the useful links section of the FCFA website, and take it from there. And if you stumble on questions and unclarities, please send an email to info@futureclimateafrica.org and see if we can help you with next steps. And so first deed to do is register as an expert. By the way, important to tell, if you register as an expert, but for some reason you don't submit any comments because you don't have time or you agree with everything or other reasons, nobody will come after you. The only thing is you won't be registered as an expert reviewer in the report because you haven't submitted anything. But that happens, of course. Sometimes people register as an expert reviewer, but they may have other priorities in life and are then not able to submit reviews. So don't worry about that.
All right, thank you. Then we have a question. What if my current unpublished research findings are quite relevant to be included in the report?
So let me take that one. So in general, the statements that are included in the Ipcc report have to be based on published outcomes. So if you have discovered something which is really relevant, which is not yet published, it can as such not be included. There can not be a reference to something that's not yet published. But on the other hand, you may be able to phrase your comment in a way that highlights particular uncertainties that are not sufficiently paid attention to, or you may actually find that there is another publication that more or less makes the same point as you want to make, and you can highlight it then in that way. So unfortunately, the review comments cannot be used to inject new research findings that have not yet been published somewhere in the Ipcc report. But there are other ways to still make your point.
Let me make one addition to that. The Ipcc assessment reports, they have certain cutoff days for introducing new literature. And I don't have that date here at hand, but we can put it in the question and answer file that we will publish later. What normally happens is once an article is accepted by a journal, then you can refer to it even if it's not yet published, but just accepted. Because once the report is published, that may take months or even a year, and then everybody can find the article. Important thing, of course, is that when people read the Ipcc reports and they see the references, they should be able to find those references in literature. That's the reason why they cannot use unpublished references. So it depends on how far you are with your publication, we will notify what the cutoff dates are for working group 2. I think you still have time.
Yeah, Leo, thank you very much. That's a crucial addition, that at the moment you make your comment, it doesn't yet have to be published. Yeah.
Right, I think we only have time for one more. And it says, do reviewers get recognition for the work done? Are these mentioned anywhere in the final document?
Yes, absolutely. The final publication will contain an annex, and in that annex, all contributors and all expert reviewers are mentioned there with their name, their affiliation, and their country. And that will give you, as a reviewer, extra visibility in your network. So the acknowledgement is there, but only at the very end of the, when it is really published. So for the working group 2 report, that would be somewhere by the end of 2021.
All right, thank you. Those are all the questions we have time to cover today. As we explained earlier on, the answers that we weren't able to cover will be done in writing, and we will notify participants following the webinar when these are all available online. We'd like to thank Leo and Arthur for addressing all those questions. What we will do now is launch a 2-minute poll, and we encourage everyone to please participate. It should be popping up on your screen now. So there are 5 questions which work on a scaling method, and your answers will provide us with insights on how we could improve our webinars. While the poll is in progress, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the participants for joining us today. We hope that you found the information valuable. Thank you to Professor Arthur Peterson and to Dr. Leo Mayo for handling your presentations, and also to Maria Jose for handling the question in Spanish. Also thanks to my SSN technical team for assisting during the webinar. This is just a reminder that the webinar recordings and copies of the English, Spanish, and French presentations will be made available on the FCFA website following the webinar. Participants will be notified once these are available online. There will also be an opportunity to receive one-to-one feedback from the presenters, but more information on this will be shared following the webinar. That concludes the poll. Thank you everybody for participating. This also ends our session for today. Thank you again for your participation and enjoy the rest of the day.